Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you
hey,
are.
Molly.
Are you, Molly? Are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Okay, well, I just want to quickly introduce myself. I think most of you know who I am, but my name's Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history here at the University of Texas. I'm also the chair of Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the director for the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Kirill, and welcome to Balkan Circle.
Thank
Kirill,
you
do you
very
want to
much.
introduce yourself?
Absolutely. It's my distinct pleasure. My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm newly minted assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and also a proud member of CREASE. And I'm very happy that this is the 5th iteration for the season, even at this virtual reality that we're all experiencing of Balkan Circle. And today we will combine very interesting topics, and we'll probably get away a little bit from politics and political problems and try to look through them through different lenses. So here is the floor. I would like to pass the floor to Professor Newberger to introduce the speaker for today at Balkan Circle.
Okay, well, it is my sincere pleasure today to introduce Masha Kolanovich, who came to the University of Texas first on a Fulbright Fellowship in, what year was that, Masha? 2014?
2012.
2012, oh my
Yes.
God, okay. So we've known each other for quite a while now.
Yeah.
I consider Masha a good friend, that's for sure, and a close collaborator on all kinds of projects. So Masha is an associate professor in the Department of Croatian Studies at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, or the department we would say, at the University of Zagreb. She's published a number of articles and a monograph called Striker Rebel Consumer, correct?
Yes, yes.
On literature and popular culture. And she's also published another number of novels, collections of stories and poetry in Croatian, some of which are translated, and many of which have captivating illustrations that she herself has drawn, which make them really special. So these include Underground Barbie. These are the translations: My America, Leeches for the Lonely, and her most recent collection of stories, Dear Insects and Other Scary Stories, which actually came out in 2019 and won the EU Prize for Literature, as well as the Vladimir Nazor Prize for Fiction, which is the most prestigious literary award in Croatia, in addition to the Audience Award at the Pula Book Fair. So this is an award-winning novel, which is just in Croatian so far. It would be really nice if we could get that translated. In terms of her more recent work, and closer to the topic of this talk, Masha co-edited and contributed to an excellent edited volume called The Cultural Life of Capitalism in Yugoslavia, which came out in 2017 with Palgrave. So check out any of those. And the last one is in English, the last volume I mentioned. So I hope you guys can check out some of these publications depending on what languages you're reading in. So we're so happy to have you today, Masha. Take it away. And wait, you should be able to share screen, but let me just make sure. Oh, whoops. Okay, now you should be able to share screen.
Yes, and I'm welcome, and I'm admitting more people to listen to the talk, Masha.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you, Mary, for this wonderful introduction. Now I have to justify all these nice words. Hopefully I will be able to do that. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight at the Croatian time. And I also hope to see you all in person, whether in Croatia or in Austin. As you can see from my background, Austin takes really important place in my heart. And this is not just a temporary setup. All of you who visited me knows that Austin is really a really special place to me. So today I'm going to speak about one particular layer of Croatian culture in the 1990s. And it's based, of course, on my search, which Mary already mentioned, about capitalism and cultural life of capitalism in socialist and post-socialist time. So if I ask you, okay, just a second, just to see how, okay, oh no, just a second, just to get, okay. So if I ask you to think a little bit what will be your remembrance, if you have any, or imagery about 1990s in post-Yugoslav region or Croatia particularly, I guess your answer would be war and bloody dissolution of Yugoslavia. And of course, you are not wrong. Indeed, when we try to detect the dominant line of cultural memory of the early 1990s in that region, as found, for example, in different intellectual testimonials, monographs of various kinds, fiction, we can see how themes of social and political transition marked by war and brutal conflict prevail. So in the countries of former Yugoslavia, the 1990s have been dominantly interpreted through the prism of so-called first wave of political transition marked by war and ethnical conflict. Some cultural critics say that in 2000s, the region entered in something called delayed cultural transition, where culture and everyday life became visibly, or at least much more visibly transformed by the new practices and rituals of consumer culture and greater flow of foreign capital into the region. For example, we saw rising shopping malls in the region. We saw more Western brands in our yard. We also saw the change in consumer rituals and habits, but we also saw dramatic consequences of the traumatic processes of privatization of the public institutions, firms, and factories. So what usually goes undetected when we speak about the 1990s, especially early part of the 1990s in Croatia, is what I call in this presentation cultural practices of inauguration, domestication, and naturalization of capitalism. So in this presentation today, I will try to outline this local quality of slowly developing, or to sound more poetic, slowly creeping capitalism within the limited cultural terrain of Croatian culture in the early 1990s. With the focus on the particular aspect of culture, I will try to offer better understanding of capitalism in post-Yugoslav region, not only as a new economic system, but also a new system of affects, morals, and values in the local environment. So I need to put a kind of a disclaimer here. I'm not the economist by my vocation and my profession. I'm a literary and cultural critic, but I will try to outline capitalism not strictly in economic terms, but from the terms of culture, morality, values, and affect. So in this presentation, my assumption is that capitalism, as well as socialism or any other system, is not only economic, ideological, and political system, but also a certain type of culture. So more specifically, for a system to be possible and made actual and real, a certain type of culture is needed, which will introduce it and legitimize it. And this in turn means that a certain type of and practices which will also challenge it and contest it will also arise as well. So my tentative thesis, or better yet, observation, is that in 1990s in Croatia, that this particular chronotope represents a challenging and unique cultural and anthropological terrain for considering local and temporal specificities of capitalism. So when speaking about capitalism in the context of Croatian post-socialist culture, we must be aware of its historical, spatial, and even local specificities in order to avoid the danger that lies in general and somewhat inflationary use of the term capitalism in cultural analysis. As cultural geographist Nigel Thrift claims, it is not as if the proponents of the cultural term do not acknowledge the importance of something called capitalism. They do, usually in one of three ways. First, capitalism can be generalized out on all pervasive cultural formation, usually through its migration into the symbolic realm. Second, capitalism can be elevated into something so self-evident that it can be turned on whenever a connective explanation is called for. Third, capitalism becomes a reading, and it can be made into transcendental haunting, both everywhere and nowhere. So Thrift concludes his text saying that force of capitalism is acknowledged, but is turned into a necessary but empty foil for the cultural turn, included certainly, but allowed no life of its own, because it's always already accounted for. So in this regard, I believe we should focus on particular temporal and socio-cultural level of the early transition period in Croatia, in order not to speak about capitalism as some kind of a transcendental haunting, but in order to, what would Pierre Bourdieu say, get our hands dirty into the kitchens of empirical research. So speaking metaphorical from my analytical and my concrete kitchen in Zagreb, tonight I will try to pose a question: what would be those local and temporal specificities about the early stage capitalism in Croatian culture in the 1990s? So I should start with some sort of historical appetizer, because as it is well known, capitalism is of course not novelty from the period after 1988 or in the early 1990s. Not to go even further in this monarchistic period of Yugoslavia, let's just briefly mention that Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, already had certain type of economic practices that occasionally approach capitalism as an untypical, or as would British historian Eric Hobsbawm would put it, somewhat eccentric member of the family of socialist system. So even though the story of Yugoslav variant of capitalism, of Yugoslav way of flirting with capitalism, would take us now too far away from our today's topic, and there's a really huge pie of literature on that issue, I just need to say as a disclaimer also that I of course consider Yugoslavia as a country that built its political, economic and cultural identity at the crossroads of the capitalist West and socialist East, maintaining politically and ideologically faithful to socialism, but experimenting with capitalism at the terrain of economy and culture. But however, this cultural life of capitalism in Yugoslavia was qualitatively and of course quantitatively different from the one we encounter after the breakup of Yugoslavia, and these two should not be equated easily, despite the fact that they could be compared in many ways. So in my presentation, I will try to address some specificities of the cultural life of capitalism in the early 1990s by taking several patterns of culture, which I find interesting and sort of symptomatic of the creation of a new structure of feelings of Croatian in that period. So now I just use two terms by British cultural critic Raymond Williams from his text Analysis of Culture. The first is the text published in the early 60s, but is still very relevant and useful in cultural analysis. And how Williams described patterns of culture is something which I will, of course, apply to my presentation. So Williams says that it is with the discovery of patterns of characteristic kind that any useful cultural analysis begins. And it is with the relationship between these patterns, which sometimes reveal unexpected identities and correspondences in separately considered activities. Sometimes again reveal discontinuities of an unexpected kind, the general cultural analysis is concerned. So the patterns, the selected cultural patterns of culture, which I will take in this presentation is, these are these three which I selected here. First is printed advertisements in the 19th, which I generally takes as a new heralds of new sensibilities of capitalism in the early 90s. The second, if this kind of, this first pattern is rooted in popular and everyday culture. The second one is rooted in academic culture. It is concerning the translated literature from the field of economics and sociology in that period, together with some domestic comments on that literature. And the third one is the voices of dissent in literature and culture of post-Yugoslav dissidents. So let's go from the first one. I'm taking the printed advertisement in the 1990s. I'm considering them as heralds of new values, heralds of new sensibility, which are widely spread and effective in the field of everyday life. Advertisements are really a genre which are mostly prominent, exposed aspect of consumer culture in everyday culture. And advertisements were in a way the most visible indicator of the transformation of socialist society into capitalist one. As cultural anthropologist Ildiko Erdej in her book with the really captivative title, saying the title of her book is called Waiting for the IKEA, says, one of the most visible features of the social transformation after the collapse of the socialist world in Eastern Europe was a change of the geography of consumption. The character of social change, which was oriented toward the transformation of a predominantly planned into a liberal market economy, was striking in creating many opportunities to satisfy consumer desires and needs. Thus, the faces of the capital cities of the former Eastern Bloc were redesigned in the spirit of the principles of the late capitalist economy's logic. Foreign brands flooded the once protected markets, huge advertising billboards appeared in the streets and the city entrances, wherever they could be placed, and symbols of capitalism such as Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and IKEA were initially embraced as a promise of a better life. I must heartily agree with Erdej with this claim, because as somebody who witnessed this change as a young kid back then, it was certainly this big billboards, or as we call it, the jumbo posters, that was a huge novelty in the geography of everyday life in Croatia at that period. So trying to show you and trying to rethink more concretely, or to get my hands dirty in the kitchens of empirical research, I took these two commercials to compare their different moral economies. The first commercial is from or ad is from the late socialist period. The second one is from the 1991, and as Erdej puts it in her quotation, these global recognizable brands were kind of a huge exposed novelty at that period. I took Coca-Cola brand, which became a symbol of, I will say, of capitalism in the global cultural consciousness, because capitalism is always imagined through a particular set of cultural assumptions or specific imagery, where the concrete concepts is often used to understand a more abstract concept. So these two Coca-Cola commercials, which I will present here, concern the socialist and post-socialist period, and I will use them to illustrate these nuances of the cultural life of capitalism in the socialist and post-socialist era. Of course, I'm aware that this is kind of reductive, just taking these two ads for explaining my thesis, but such choice was prompted by the observation that despite the fact of the, for example, visual similarities between these two commercials. They are using different moral economy, and the commercial found in socialism cannot be found in post-socialist period anymore, and that goes vice versa for the commercial from the post-socialist period. So let's now take a closer look on these two commercials. The first one is published in the newspapers called Radničke novine, or the workers' newspaper, and Coca-Cola is basically congratulating to all the working people and citizens of Socialist Republic of Croatia the day of the uprising of the people of Socialist Republic of Croatia, which was celebrated on July 27. So, although this message of congratulation is not explicit imperative for consumption, we very well know that leisure time is very often articulated by spending, and especially when it comes to this multinational brand of Coca-Cola, which basically in our days becomes a synonym with, for example, Christmas. So, however, in this example from late socialism, it is a socialist, or more precisely anti-fascist holiday on which Coca-Cola is congratulating to the workers and citizens of Socialist Republic of Croatia. The text basically says Coca-Cola and the Coca-Cola bottlers in Belgrade, Zagreb, Sarajevo, Lipljan, and Žalec congratulate all the workers and citizens this holiday. No doubt one can find other advertisements for Coca-Cola in socialism, but one thing is certain: we cannot find Coca-Cola's or anybody else's congratulatory message of the day of uprising, which is not even valid holiday anymore and in Croatia, or any other anti-fascist holiday in advertisements in the post-socialist period, nor have the workers been pointed out as relevant social subject in any advertisement in post-socialist period anymore. So now let's go to this second commercial, which kind of also uses Coca-Cola logos for advertising these vending machines for refrigerated drinks, dominating with the aesthetics of Coca-Cola. So visually, these two commercials are not too different in a way, but let's see now what the verbal messages is saying. So this other commercial is published in daily newspapers, Večernji list, on February 1991, when Yugoslavia still nominally existed, but the first armed incidents that broke out in August 1990 already took place in Croatia. So let's now go in medias res to this message. So what is this commercial basically saying? Your opportunity to get rich quick and easily. Put these vending machines on be the first and put these vending machines on the best places. Be the first. And those best places are listed. Train and bus stations, schools, universities, companies, beaches, marinas, shops, department stores, hospitals, and clinics. So what is interesting, this opportunity to get rich quickly and easy represents is what I would call this new morality, of this new structure of feeling of quick and easy money, which Croatian sociologist Josip Županov detected and described as the value of gaining unlimited wealth, which became more explicitly, I will say, exposed in the 1990s. So what is interesting in this also enlisting of these topography, these are not just concrete places where people can install these machines. This is also a list, the social semiotic, which does not refer only to specific location, but also to symbolic public places which were randomly included in privatization and commercialization during the so-called second wave of economic transition. As claimed by RD, public spaces which in socialism materialized the public good and were accessible to broad sections of the population were rapidly transformed into private ones, which serve capital and whose use is limited by the decisions of new owners and investors. It was important to be the first in that scramble because the moment of such opportunity is truly unique. I have now a little digression from my last weekend visit to Zadar, which I found this interesting kiosk which is offering tours to National Park Kornati. As we can see, some topography of private space and explicitly, I will say, accented the word private is here, where we have private islands, private beach, and private dolphins. I wonder what could that be? But something which I found kind of in a way corresponding with this list of this advertisement. So we can see that of course, I think just took these two examples of Coca-Cola advertisements because of the reason I mentioned before. But the other advertisements of the period also encourage this, I will say, explicitly encourage this Western type of abundance, which were, for example, in a socialist period, more, I will say, fashion as a socialist achievement of abundance. But as we can see, for example, in a newspaper start from the 90s, like phones you could before only see in foreign movies, you can now get them in Croatia, or we can see selling of the apartments according to the highest standards, according to the highest US standards. So what is interesting from these selected examples, the workers disappeared from such imagery, and I will say Croatian citizens as consumers, according with the Western model, were kind of promoted. And even though, of course, we can speak about maybe about that later, because this kind of comparison with socialism is maybe something which is mostly interesting here, but we can see, I will say, a new kind of moral economy which could not be so explicitly exposed in socialist period. So this was a selective pattern from popular and everyday culture. Let's go now. Okay, I just wanted to say that it goes, of course, parallel with the war and war propaganda posters, just to show this parallel about the 1990s, which we dominantly interpreted through this prism of war. Let's now go to the second pattern of academic culture, and just let's take a look of the economic and social literature which was published and especially translated in that period in the early 1990s. So what is interesting in that period, that we are witnessing on the intellectual turn in the middle of the big social, political, and economic changes. And we are, and the theoretical literature from that field is offering new theoretical view of capitalism, and of course, new reading of socialism, which is as shadow always following these new ideas on capitalism. As I mentioned before, I'm not economist by nature, so I will not analyze this literature in terms of what economic concepts are they offering, but I will be more focused on what I call affective statements related to capitalism and socialism in what, as a literary critic, we call this paratextual elements. All those small comments on the margins, such as forewords, afterwards, notes, which are particularly interesting in detecting this specific new morality and new effective economy of capitalism in the 1990s. So in this regard, very interesting translation appeared in the 1991 from one of the leading Yugoslav publisher in textbooks and literature in the field of humanistics of any kind. It is Školska knjiga, still very prominent today, when we had a translation of US textbook, economic textbooks by Samuel Bowles and Richard Edwards. It's called Understanding Capitalism. And very interesting part of introducing this book in a back then still Yugoslav market was afterward by local economist Luka Marković in 1991. So I have this little bit bigger quote from Marković, which represents this, I would say, schizophrenic feelings about socialism and capitalism in that period, where Marković is still kind of angry on Bowles and Edwards who are being reductive to socialist countries and socialist experience. But where Marković is also being very bitter about socialism, especially in terms of lack of goods, economic abundance, and so on. So this is the quote which I can read just to give you this impression how discourse was very effective and schizophrenic back then. I will just quote Marković. It can hardly make any sense to reapproach Bowles and Edwards, who, when speaking about the former socialist countries, do what everyone else does, behaving as if they have reached the edge of the planet. Everything that can be learned from this book about socialism in Eastern Europe is, it is some different kind of class society, it is undemocratic and completely unattractive. In terms of theory, this says nothing about the regimes that function to the misfortune of their peoples for a good part of the century. Regimes in which many people spend their whole lives, which for many were shortened and everybody was shortchanged. The regimes in which much occurred in economic terms and which represent an overwhelming empirical body to be perceived as some kind of a political state of emergency, which only happened to last a little longer as a sort of aberration from the capitalist normal state of affair. So this is just a small extract from Marković, very effectively articulated afterward. And what is interesting, Bowles and Edwards themselves are starting their books saying, of course, this claim is regarding US context, which this book was initially published in the mid-80s. But Bowles and Edwards are saying that understanding capitalism is necessarily in the comprehension of our reality, and it has become essential for anybody who reads the newspapers, read the evening news, listens to the political candidates, or simply bewildered by how difficult it is to find a job or pay the bills. So this our reality and this now from the Bowles and Edwards book is becoming kind of performative, actual for Yugoslavia back then. So if this book was kind of a gentle performative act of introducing capitalism as necessity to still then Yugoslav audience, we have this other example is much more, I will say, explicit in showing capitalism as necessity in local context. It is a textbook also by a US Nobel Prize winner for economy, Paul Anthony Samuelson, and his co-writer William Nordhaus. Is the textbook simply called Economy. And what is interesting in a footnote about the translation of this book, the publisher is saying how the copyrights for the book were maintained in Yugoslavia, but the book is published in independent states of Croatia. And the book doesn't have this kind of afterword or preview as the other textbook, but it has a list of 33 firms, including Zagreb Stock and Change and banks, who supported publishing these books. But what is interesting, this book is bringing the original preface to this textbooks by author Paul Anthony Samuelson himself for the Eastern European market. And what is interesting is that Samuelson and Nordhaus are dominantly interpreting the events in Eastern Europe after 1989 in terms of economics, bringing on free market economy as a main argument of dissatisfaction of the people from the Eastern Europe, just to see how they are viewing this situation in the Eastern Europe. I will quote them. And in the most dramatic event of all, the peoples of Eastern Europe abandoned their socialist shackles and decided to try market capitalism in order to increase their standard of living. It was a triumph of the market as a way of organizing an advanced, technologically sophisticated economy. So what is interesting in terms of conceptual metaphors applied to socialism, this shackles or chains, which, for example, are often used in showing how socialist countries were lacking democratic or political freedom, they are using this term and applying them in the terms of economy. And what is also interesting, they are interpreting the revolutions in the former Eastern Europe bloc also in the terms of economy, saying today the countries of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union and elsewhere are pressed by economic revolutions. People are tearing up walls, overthrowing established authorities and demanding a market economy because they are dissatisfied with their centralized socialist governments. Students like you are marching in their desire to gain the right to learn from Western textbooks like this one, hoping that they will be able to experience economic growth and the standard of living of market economy. So this, I will say, economic interpretation of revolution is bringing us closer to this book, which is also translated in the mid-1990s in Croatia, is the book by the US sociologist Peter Berger called The Capitalist Revolution, 50 Propositions about Prosperity, Equality, and Liberty, where originally Berger books was also published in the mid-80s in States, and the new edition on the translation of into Croatian is holding his preface when he is, I will say, euphorically saying how socialism needed to be ended because all those reasons which basically Samuels and Nordhaus were mentioning, and Berger is of course saying that Marxism and socialism are mythopoetic creations, and that one might even say that only genuine revolution under modern condition is that of democratic capitalism. I will not go further in the examples. It is the time also when famous Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, was translated into Croatia, and all these sorts of endish talks about socialism, when socialism needed to be buried in all sorts of terms, political, cultural, and economic, was taking place at that period. Also a book by famous Croatian sociologist already mentioned here, Josip Županov, and his book also had this sort of endish title called Poslije potopa, or After the Flood, where Županov claims, as a social system, socialism has not shown itself to be acceptable alternative that can work at least as well as capitalism, since it can never surpass it. Although some serious scientists has until recently tried to convince us that in one form or another, socialism is even more efficient than capitalism, there is no point in wasting words on the subject anymore. Recent developments have given us a clear and ambiguous answer to that question. Socialism did not pass the test of satisfying man's need from individual consumption to economic development and political freedom, and therefore it had to become a history. So what is basically common in all these comments is that where capitalism and socialism were analyzed, socialism is lending itself always as a shadow of capitalism, and it needed to be intellectually dismantled when capitalism needed to be effectively introduced and legitimized in this field and this branch of literature. And it is clear that such reflection had a wider social impact in terms of production and distribution of specific value judgments and ethics about capitalism and rise and dying socialism at that time. But to make also and to show another angle on all this topic, because culture is never a homogeneous space, I would like to point on specific voices of resistance in the text of, I will say now already canonized post-Yugoslav dissidents. Among the, not so many of them, but still enough to speak about the post-Yugoslav culture in that period. There are, of course, most famous Dubravka Ugrašić, Slavenka Drakulić, Predrag Matvejević, Boris Puden, Bora Ćosić, and so on, not to go any further in listing. I would like to point on one specific layer of their text, because they were also dominantly interpreted in terms of being critical to rising nationalism and nationalist culture of that period. But I find one specific feature of their text particularly interesting in terms of criticizing capitalism. And in their texts. Their texts are offering specific quality of remembering socialism, which is holding skepticism toward capitalism, and which is also offering demystification of the dominantly US capitalism, which was evoked in those previous texts of intellectuals and theoretics as a kind of role model of capitalism. So what is interesting also, I will just now kind of put focus in these two authors, which I believe are also familiar to you, because their texts were almost like parallel published in English at that period in the 90s. So both authors also experienced living in the West, which facilitated the formation of their critical distance toward the global capitalism of the 1990s, which had until that point lured the socialist East with its desire. So what is interesting, and what I also find particularly progressive in their text, is that by using moral economy of back then, I will say, stigmatized Yugoslav socialism, they are offering a criticism of capitalism in that period. And that became kind of, I will say, kind of a steady tone in their works till present time, especially in works of Dubravka Ugrašić. First book of essays of Dubravka Ugrašić published in the post-socialist period. She was before that, I will say, the most prominent writer of postmodernist poetic in the late 80s, was this book of essay called in Croatian Američki fikcionar, or how it is translated into English. The title goes From the Balkan War to the American Dream. This first book of essays brought many troubles to Dubravka Ugrašić. It is basically really, I would say, peaceful, critical text about all this was going on in the 1990s in the region. But another layer of this book is Ugrašić's comments on the US capitalism. And this, I will say, two parallel narratives about US capitalism and bloody war in Yugoslavia at that period are two equally presented parts in this book of essays. So what is interesting in that book, the United States, or simply America, as a term Ugrašić used more often, functions as a deeply rooted metaphor of capitalist West. In this book, the author is particularly critical of the superficial culture of the US consumerist mentality, in which spectacle, narcissism, disinterest, and ignorance, as Ugrašić says, prevail. The author criticism of capitalism is also expressed in identification of the author with the economically weak subjects, such as homeless, African Americans, and we can generally say, others of capitalism in that period. And in this is what indirectly echoes is the symbolic inheritance of the moral and affective economy of the Yugoslav experience of social justice, which falls into oblivion in the hegemonic culture of Croatia in the 1990s. Adding some more concrete example is Drakulić's book of essays, How We Survive Communism and Even Laugh, and which also very often evokes West, particularly United States, in her commenting on socialism and comparison with socialist culture. And this particular quote is very interesting because it uses, I will say, Yugoslav, or more generally speaking, socialist moral economy as a source of defamiliarization of capitalism. And particularly, I find interesting this term which Drakulić is using. It is called communist I. And what Drakulić is saying in this essay is this specific quality of this remembrance of socialism, which still sticks to post-socialist subject at that period. I will just quote her. There is a deeper reason why the poverty stick to us, why we recognize beggars, homeless people, bumps, pretty thieves, drunks, the sick, junkies, why we take it all so personally, why it hurt us. It's because we have a communist eye, like a third spiritual eye placed in the middle of one's forehead. This eye scans only a certain type of phenomenon. It is selective for injustice. Even if the socialist states have fallen apart, the ideas of equality and justice haven't. They're still with us, built in like a chip. We remember them from school, from our movies, from literature, glorifying the idea of justice, as well as from the clean, beggarless streets of our cities. Transplanted to the United States, we carry this idea and much more with us, like excess baggage that perhaps we would like to drop off or leave at the entrance of this other promised world. So I wanted to show by taking these patterns of Ugrašić and Drakulić essays that these authors in their criticism of capitalism is inseparable from the evaluation of the collapse of socialism and the growth of nationalism, which can be interpreted as a part of the critical legacy of the effective and moral economy of Yugoslav socialism that retains a reasonable skepticism toward capitalism. And I want to also point to this layer of their work, which is, I will say, still inefficiently explored in their writings. So moving more to the conclusion of my presentation, I wanted to present you these particular patterns of cultures which are merging on the ruins of Yugoslav socialism, where I look on culture as a very affective, I will say, site of developing and creating new moral economy of capitalism. And just to kind of make a synthesis of those patterns included here, I wanted to show advertising, which creating the imagery of post-socialist consumer who wanted to satisfy his new and growing desires quickly and easily. A consumer who symbolically took off his working clothing and who needed to be awakened from his socialist slumber and stimulating into taking more entrepreneurial initiatives. Second was this economic and social thought that had a task of creating a new post-socialist intellectual in whom socialism has to be morally and effectively delegitimized, and capitalism has to be legitimized and wholeheartedly embraced as an inevitable economic and value that contributes to the democratization and general improvement of material condition. And at the end, finally, I tried to point to very important voices of resistance, which kept their skepticism about Western capitalism, dismantling some imagological and ideological stereotypes about the West as an economic utopia, and which preserved the memory of the moral and affective economy of Yugoslav socialism, which was systematically delegitimized in the mainstream culture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Masha. We really do appreciate and it was Really good. I know that you said that Zoom is not as similar as live encounter, but this is as close as we could get. And I'm so, while people are, getting, ready with their questions, I'm so much under the impression of this image that you took recently about the private dolphins.
Okay, yeah.
Because frankly, I think that, in the audience is, I have fellow Bulgarians and everyone else who's been, kind of carry on the topic about post-socialism and the transformation and how it manifests itself. When I saw this private beach, it immediately jumped on me the idea that you're describing, especially into a mutation about, application of this utopia that becomes very quickly a dystopia in terms of state capture. And recently we saw, at least in Bulgaria, countless, they still continue protests, which had a high focal point of actually protesters going on, at least one of them, going to the so-called private beach of the Sarai of Ahmed Dugan, politician associated with corruption and state capture. And when you showed this, that was my first association. I'm like, but the private dolphins were I think,
Yes.
a step up. So thank you very much for this fantastic presentation. And Dr. Newberger, now is probably the time to give chance to our guests and our seminar today to have their questions if you have gathered them. Thank you, Masha. Dr. Newberger.
Well, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, either in the participant thing or just, I think I can see you all do that. If I can ask the first, I'm always happy to ask the first question though. Okay, so I love this idea that you brought up in the terminology of the kind of domestication of capitalism or naturalization. And I think you had one other term, but I didn't manage to get it into my notes, so I was bummed. But
inauguration.
But I guess my question is, we kind of see how this is working in the 90s, and I remember that exact process going on in Bulgaria because I was there a lot in the 1990s, and actually also in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, kind of witnessed this thing going on. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how successful were these kind of foot soldiers of this new kind of moral economy of capitalism? And how much sort of deeper resistance did they meet? Because I mean, we know, we can say, this work of Drakulic, et cetera, and Ugoresic, but it feels to me like that communist eye they're talking about was really deeply implanted. And I just remember people sort of assuming, not necessarily being anti-McDonald's, but assuming that people they knew who were getting rich, that it was a corrupt pattern, and that they had to be, they were definitely dishonest, and that there was, and I think continues to be, a connection with not all that is capitalist, but with, some aspects of that, especially with the super rich, as being tied to corruption and the mafia. And to me, that's obviously become like a big flashpoint today. So did it create a culture war, I guess, between those two sides, or was one side sort of triumphant?
Okay, so speaking maybe 1 foot within my personal memory and 1 foot on the documents, there was a really some sort of euphoria about, I'll say, capitalist West at this beginning. For example, if you, let's speak now more, we will come to in terms of former Yugoslavia and Croatia more specifically, but for example, if you just write, there's a really great YouTube video, which I always show to my students, is the opening of the first McDonald's in Moscow, showing this huge line of people waiting for their, portion of fries, and parallelly, you have the image of devastated, stores with groceries, with nothing there. But this euphoria existed. And this kind of a corruptive culture also existed in the early 90s. Of course, in terms of normal people, the ones who preserve this communist eye, from their perspective, those people were looked at as thieves, but it was not so self-evident anymore. Only later, when you have people on trials, when you have kind of you have explosion of this legalized robbery, people are getting back in those terms, and they are now rethinking those concepts, I will say, more strongly. And Dubravka Ugrešić and Slavika Dragulić were in the 19th perceived as witches. They were stigmatized. Ugrešić had like a real physical threats into her home. That's why she left the country. So in that day, it was like really not easy to be a post-Yugoslav dissident. It was like not just a performative act. It was really a risking of getting, I don't know, slammed by the street by some crazy guy. So I will say that this was a real marginal voice on the margin, which now becomes like more visible. And I will say back then it was not so visible what was going on in these terms of the corruption, but later it was in this all sorts of euphoria of just taking the old symbols, putting news, wearing socialism, and only after, when this utopia, as every promise, turned out to be illusory, because it showed its really, I would say, devastating consequences on the working class culture, which was kind of, beaten off from the public representation in that period, when you have now like mass of unemployed people, when the factories are just being rusty and rotting, nothing is done in that place, then you have this more sobering effect now, I would say, in much more larger amount.
Well, I feel like I could talk to you about this for about an hour over a glass of wine, but I also want to just open it up and make sure if there's any other questions people can ask. Vlad, go ahead.
Vlad.
Masha, thank you so much for this really rich and wonderful presentation. And I really love your archive in this piece, and the way it goes from, advertisements, which are embedded in this social geography, very public text, to these kind of social textbooks, to works of literature. I really thought that was really wonderful. I guess my question is specifically because you deal with popular culture a lot in your work, and what was fascinating to me about your presentation was the kind of insidious way that this process, these changes, had happened at this time. I mean, visually, right? They were quite prominent, quite striking. I mean, these big billboards that suddenly appeared in the landscape. But there were also these Trojan horses, right? So one of these was, like, as you were talking about, the language of the revolution that was completely co-opted, right, by these neoliberal economists, which is, this is a more scary thing. And I think another thing that I've been sort of thinking about, like the language of diversity and difference that was co-opted as well by capitalism. Suddenly in this way of, expressing your identity of, and that's something that sort of, as progressives, it's something that's sort of sacred to us in a way. It's like we would like to use that language, but now it becomes problematic because, again, this there's a lot of co-optation, right? And it's like how to resist that, how to resist this co-optation of these languages that, these words that, meant one thing at one moment and now are basically, speaking the language of the marketplace.
Thank you for your comments. And I'm also really intrigued by this idea. And I'm kind of intrigued this in a sort of literary worker or as a writer, especially when speaking about the revolution. One thing that struck me, we had this mobile phone company which offered their new kind of a package called the Revolution, and it was like really
commercializing the revolution, right?
Yes. So really the language of capitalism, the language of banking, advertising, the commercials is co-opting this language. But and that's something which is also it's a culture war in terms of language, not just symbols, like and that's why I'm interested in specific this symbolic terrain of culture, where we don't have to see it only in a classist Marxist term that the changes in economy comes first, and then you have like, you know, the superstructure. I think in this sense, you first needed to kind of effectively prepare people for this change, and that's why the language comes in, and then you need to kind of occupy the language, occupy the symbols, and this is something which is going on like to a recent times. So, but my kind of thought, which goes without an answer here, is like we have this cooptation of the worlds of, I don't know, revolution, work per se, working culture, but I cannot see, we see how the language is being kind of, this corporative language is kind of be silent about factory workers. They are really one who are left there alone.
Masha, thank you for this. And while we will be picking up another question, very just to the point of what Vlad was talking about, it's just awesome, you know, train of thought here going. Have you detected, while you were showing the commercials, which I thought was striking, you know, like with the workers' holiday and the uprising, and then the vending machine, get quick, really rich, and, you know, the easy way I was thinking about making money, like predetermined formula for making you rich. Now, what in regards to what Vlad was asking, do you see practices of culture jamming? You know, just because you said there was a package of a revolution, you know, which is basically appropriation, right, of an absolutely different language and making it mainstream commercial. I think Naomi Klein was talking about this, about mining cool, right? You know, picking up everything, and now it's part of the, you know, buying and selling process. But are there any particular Croatian examples of culture jamming of this cultural jiu-jitsu, I would say?
Yeah, cultural jamming is really interesting phenomena, and it's also interesting how easily is being as well co-opted by capitalism. For example, in all this, I don't know, I was particularly interested in these commercials by the brand Diesel, the clothing brand Diesel. Yeah, they have all this like line of commercials which were being critical to capitalism, and it was like disgusting, and selling jeans for, I don't know, $500 at the same time. So, but speaking in terms of Croatian cultural jamming, you can find there was a practice of one guerrilla group, which accidentally I know them in person, so I know they were the one who were doing it, and they were just doing simple like spraying on the jumbo posters, and they were like a feminist culture jamming group.
Graffiti, you mean?
Yeah, like graffiti on these big billboards, and they were particularly keen on like a place of women in the commercials at that period, because many like naked bodies and like unrespectful representation of women. We have even like formed like a group of like a women from the women association who started reacting on commercials which are representing women in very like sexualized or unrespectful ways. So there were this kind of culture jamming intervention, but I can say that much of culture jamming has been done in field of literature, in the prose of Croatian transition. Maybe I can also make a parallel with Viktor Peljevin's book Generacija P, when you also have this kind of game with the language of commercials in his novel, we can find many examples of that in the prose, in the fiction, where I can now tell you, I mean, these are writers, even their works has been translated, such as Robert Perišić or Vlado Bulić, who are playing with this new language of commercials in their novels and in their short stories.
So literature is a field of resistance.
Yes, yes, yes.
Dr. Newberger, do you see any other question? Because I have, just
I know, I
this
could keep
presentation
asking
sparked,
questions
and I can,
So,
but I don't want to occupy.
I want to make sure, yeah. Does anyone else have
everybody
questions? We're going to give you an opening here. Okay, Chris.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Chris.
had a sort of a comment that will go into a question. One of the things that was very striking to me in the examples from the economic books that you provided was that there was an assumption of subjectivity that was very European. So if you only have rational rules, that if only you tear down the walls and break chains and bad authority, they'll just release this natural kind of individualistic kind of capitalist energy in its right way. So you have the right subjects, but the wrong institutions. But as the 90s and 2000s played out, and now you have liberal democracy and contractual relations and free markets. All of a sudden, there was all this criticism and problems. Like, why aren't these institutions doing the right thing? Why are these societies still stuck in all these problems and economic difficulties? And you see the explanations flipping over, and it becomes, oh, well, it's Balkan mentalities or legacy that's still mine. And so there you have right institutions, but now the wrong people, and that's the problem. So it's always there was always this kind of inverse step to how everything was supposed to work out and how.
He's kind of in and out.
Yeah, yes.
And now you're frozen, Chris.
It's cutting out.
But I think the gist of what he was saying is really interesting. And that is, before it was like, oh, we just give them, capitalism, everything will be great. And then like, oh, well, it's not working. It must be because they're backwards Balkan peoples. I mean, is that kind of the gist, Chris?
Yeah,
what I mean? It's them. It's not the institutions that are bad. It's not capitalism that's bad. They are bad, essentially.
Right. Well, and then my question.
To be crude, I mean, just yeah.
I hope I'm coming in.
Now you're okay, yeah.
Okay. As now we've been progressing for several decades now within, kind of self-critique within Croatia and the Balkans. Do you see, are there new kinds of representation the subject out in advertising is moved on from this original, socialist subject and, capitalist subject? Is there something new, or is it still the same, the kind of neoliberal subject?
Whether it's a repetition, I understand. I'm sorry that because it's the cutting out, it's just, words come. That's okay.
Okay, I also, because it was cutting out, I'm not sure if please correct me if I didn't understand everything correct. But when speaking this kind of maybe a view on the people, like maybe post-colonial view on the people, like people are guilty, they were never satisfied, or you had the wrong thing. I will say that in this first era of the 90s, people were very effectively engaged in dismantling socialism, bearing it down, criticizing everything, reducing it into totalitarianism and dictatorship, which was in the 90s kind of I will say, effect also of the war and trying to speak about some things which were not able to speak in, especially like in Croatia during the socialist period. But after this first euphoria kind of melted down, all these people, especially I will say the younger generation who was not engaged in the war or was not so effectively engaged in dismantling socialism, suddenly starting to talk about the free education, free healthcare system, And there were many narratives, nostalgic narratives about the Yugoslav standard of living, which is kind of a kind of a paradox now when we take those quotations from Samuels and Nordhaus when they're saying people from Eastern Europe want the better standard. Now we have this nostalgic narratives very well documented about the Yugoslav standard of living. Maybe Yugoslavia could be seen here a little bit as an exception, but you have, you know, organized summer holidays within your firm. You had free education. You had department store, like as Dubravka Ugrišić in her last book of essay, a little bit ironically puts it, Yugoslavia was a hedonistic parody of Eastern Bloc. So the standard was kind of different, and you have now all these different narratives from all these different people about socialism, regarding all those things which people thought were kind of bad and needed to be in a free market race or something. So I will be kind of more cautious about this, because this is a constant. Post-socialist period is very nuanced in all this kind of a small historical period of 30 years. You can see really many nuances from the 19th to the I don't know, to our days in all those narratives about all those things. Sometimes even the same people are saying quite different things. And that I think kind of answers your second question about the imagery of advertising later. Were they different? Of course they were. They became kind of this type of estrangement, this type of euphoria became less visible. They were kind of just more integrated in the more developed consumer society in the 2000s. That's what I show at the beginning of my presentation, what some cultural critics call delayed cultural transition, when shopping malls, like more elaborated brands, department stores such as IKEA, H&M, and so became the part of the everyday consumer culture. So there was no more need for this performative act of persuasion, not just for consuming this or that product, but also performative act of saying, come on guys, this is good, this is what we want, you know, leave this, you know, leave this what was in socialism behind, and let's now all go to this, you know, quick and easy story. I hope I understood and answer your questions okay.
Well, so it's basically 1:15, so our time is officially over, but we want to stay actually and keep talking to Masha. So anyone who wants to stay can. We were thinking of just for another 15 minutes continuing to have this conversation. So
the addition of Balkan Circle, you know, is like speaking with the author afterward the presentation is the awesomeness of this seminar. So Masha, just because there are so many interesting,
we're not going to let you go yet. So
we're not going to let you go.
I booked all this night just for you, Tim. So
thank you. You know, it's
other plans.
It's so good to have, you know, this transatlantic relationship actually, you know, materializing. And you know, it would have been better having you here live in Austin with us. However, we're using every opportunity to have this very fruitful conversation on very, very topical issues that you were addressing. And I'm going to ask, read you a question that you know, comes from the audience, and this is from Ruslan Trad, who says, how are the authorities in Croatia cope with the nostalgia and the current cultural trends in the national movements, for example?
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is nostalgia is also very nuanced term. There's also like piles and piles of literature on this term, and we can also trace the narratives of nostalgia from the 19th to our present times. For if Drakulić and Ugrišić were, I will call first ladies of nostalgia in the 19th, and were stigmatized because of that by the pejorative term Jugo-nostalgičar, which was actually coined by the first Croatian president, Franjo Tuđman, and was delegitimizing political awareness or political soberness of that period. And I wanted to show it in this particular case how this political, how actually this remembering of socialism has also its political sharpness. So it was really, they were kind of the only ones with this group of post-Yugoslav, not so large, but still, I would say, large enough to speak about this amount of critical mass of post-Yugoslav dissidents who were pointing on, especially on this devastating treatment of Yugoslav symbols and books and legacies, when you basically had this cleansing of archives and libraries, is something which Vlad is, I know now, writing in his new book about all this stuff. And what happened,
yes, indeed.
speaking to kind of connect some of the topics we discussed here, what happened? Capitalism co-opted the nostalgia, and it happened that Dubravka Ugrešić, who was writing with melancholy and sadness what was going to the socialist legacy in material and symbolic terms in the 19th, she said, she pointed out in her book of essays published in 2000, it's called Europe in Sepia, saying that nostalgia became mental supermarket of the former Eastern Europe bloc, and is and it's of course co-opted by capitalism in different varieties of projects. If you visited, I don't know, East Berlin, you know that, or East Berlin, sorry, Berlin, contemporary Berlin, you can see how the majority of, I don't know, souvenirs is made out of, you know, East Berlin, pieces of wall, and so on. And what is, of course, dangerous in this commercialization and capitalist cooptation of nostalgia, that it erases this difficult and important political questions which nostalgia brings.
Yes.
Yes, it's not just somebody said because it was he or she was younger and better looking in socialism. It is all this,
in terms of relevance.
Yes, exactly. A relevance of political discourse and this violent erasure of all this socialist legacy which happened in the 19th, not just in a metaphorical but in a really concrete way of you know, ruin the monuments, burning the books, and it's something which should not, it was not supposed to happen.
Thank you. I saw that Vlad is reacting. Vlad, did you want to, because you were nodding, and when Masha was talking about, would you like to add your comment? Because I saw that were trying to say something. Is that correct?
I mean, I would love to have, just to continue the conversation. I love everything what you're saying. It really resonates with the work that I'm doing. And one of the questions that I had for you was, so there is this kind of anti-capitalist critique, and you are certainly part of that is sort of emerging in the former Yugoslavia. And I am just wondering, so there is this there's other aspect to this kind of anti-capitalist critique that can also kind of veer towards nationalism, right? So, right, let's reject globalization, let's reject this kind of, multinational capitalism, and let's sort of withdraw into this kind of autarky, right? Have our, national community as a fortress against, right, multinational capitalism. So, in terms of navigating, right, the extent to which, anti-capitalist critique can become a kind of a Trojan horse, again, for nationalism and for, which you are obviously not doing, but, I could see, there have been strains of that, I think, and not just in Croatia.
I
Thank you, Vlad.
since you kind of evoke my personal political habitus, I just wanted to say that as somebody who grew up in the period of transition, in a period where you literally had like half of your schooling in one regime, and you saw this, you witnessed dismantling of one system and kind of production, like literary production in front of your eyes of another, and you had this kind of a still innocent political awareness of all what was happening. But then what you can do, you kind of became more sensible of this discursive dismantling. And what is kind of my political poetic, which is of course connected to what I do as a literary critic and as a writer, is being staying skeptical about all this kind of narratives. That is the lesson which I learned from literature, which I learned from Ugrešić and Drakulić, and staying skeptical for all these processes. Do I have like, can I like kind of point to some kind of, oh, this political option or system, this is right? I think there always must be a resistance who will point to these absurdities, first in the language, in a space of culture, and then of course in the politics, which is just kind of another variant of discourse. Stay skeptical and always fight for some, I will say, human values. And I will say, even though growing up in the transition was painful in many ways, I will say that this kind of now to kind of co-opt the word capital, but from the critical perspective, it brought me some kind of intellectual and critical capital in just raising my critical and political awareness about everything which I witness in this public arena.
Which is actually what we call compressed time, because we have our generation, at least, and
Yes.
I consider part of this, like we see so many things, happening in such a small space. At this point of time, I just saw, because we're almost running out of time, Dan Keys, made a remark. And do you have a question, sir, for our speaker? Maybe I misunderstood. Okay, because I saw that short remark. Masha, last from me before we let you go. When you spoke about those three big patterns, and I just wanted to ask you just a general observation, not so much, with a critical eye from your scholarly perspective, is what are the other features of post-socialist culture that are most distinct besides those three that you showed us? If you say, like, for Croatia today, there is something that each of us should know when thinking about this, post-Yugoslav future, going forward.
I would say that's an interesting question. I would say that education is one big, I will say, pattern which could also be included here, which could also see this huge change in interpreting and in this way kind of producing this new consciousness, this new sensibility about all this. And it's also very complex and huge question, and a part of this translated literature was just kind of a glance of that. But if for being like kind of more detailed, one should take also the education in primary schools, in high schools, to see how all this dismantling was going on. And you basically have each year different textbooks that interprets various political events in different ways, which is really very like unstable.
So it's kind of battle for meaning, for conditioning, the future generations and priming them, because you were showing us those textbooks.
What will be also now, I mean, now you really posed a question which we can kind of go on and on and on to think, but another layer will be urbanism and the cityscapes. The cityscapes, and also practices of memorials, practices of memory. For example, the day of the uprising, which I mentioned, is not legally anymore holiday in Croatia anymore. So, like new sets of holidays, change of streetscapes, the names of the streets, new memorial practices, narratives in the museums. If we go, this could be like a really huge project in, is this big archive of which shows this all these changes. And maybe just to go back on what we spoke just before about this, speaking on education and kind of to wrap it out all together, all these lessons from post-socialism in transition, I think are useful for each environment, for each chronotype, for example, the United States at the moment. And what I found in terms of staying critical upon those issues is, and what kind of scares me is depreciation of humanistic type of knowledge. And by humanistic type of knowledge, humanities in general, I think especially being sensitive to the language and being sensitive to the narratives. And I think that's something which US culture needs now more than ever also, to be sensitive in, interpreting all these representations. And if we kind of lose this critical awareness and especially education in humanities, I think it will be just very easier for somebody to manipulate with us. And I think that's why it's so important, even though we now all speak about the economic growth and material standard, but this is something which is really, really important.
Yeah, if I could just have the last word. I mean, one, I don't know if I gushed enough about how great your presentation was. Thank you so much, Masha. But it just makes me think about how this process of domestication of capitalism was, first of all, an enormous undertaking, because just as changing the economy and political system was like, I think a professor of mine at the time said, taking a pyramid and turning it over, you have to have that same kind of revolution of the mind. And how do you do that in a chaotic way? Like under communism, you could create a kind of coherent narrative with a coherent sort of state-controlled set of sort of voices, but this is more sort of free market sort of chaos of these voices. How does that happen? But I wonder, like, how it happened in former Yugoslavia was probably quite different than how it happened, for example, in Bulgaria. And one of the differences, of course, is that they're doing it when this war is breaking out and when the country itself is fragmenting, which was not the case in places like Bulgaria or Romania. So that would be really interesting to kind of think through, like, what did that mean for that process?
You're so right, and I agree that Yugoslavia is also a really specific case in that sense, and I will say that transition before transition, that's why I always was pointing on the socialist period, because you cannot kind of make, even though it's very different, it's still, you always need to carry this intellectual baggage of what was going on. And I will say that even transition before transition, we can even go to the 80s, where the explicit signs of political and economic crisis could be found in a large amount of cultural text. Yesterday, I was like with my friends and we were watching some sketches from this famous Yugoslav TV show called Better Life. It's kind of a famous soap opera from the 80s. And we were watching and we were kind of laughing and get chills at the same time when they were presenting a sort of class meeting from the professors in one classrooms. And they needed to kind of, sorry for being so detailed, but I just cannot resist saying this, and it's so fresh from yesterday. So the teachers needed to kind of hire up 1 mark to 1 student. And they were deciding, so for him to get a better grade in general. And they were deciding, okay, who will give him the better grade? And the chemistry teacher says, this is the age of chemistry, it is very important, I cannot do that. He gets what he deserves. And then my teacher from mathematics says, no, I cannot also do it. And then they all pointed to the teacher of art history saying, but you can give him, And
Inflate.
teacher from and you know, it's 1986, I think, when this episode, don't take me for sure, but it's of course mid-80s. And the teacher from art history is saying, you know, you fools, you will see how people will have terrible aesthetics, how they will just look on their computers, they will live in ugly apartments, they will consume kitsch, and you want me to lower? And you know, there are like a flood of those signs in the 80s where you don't know, oh, if you show it, sometimes I show it to my students and say, do you think this text is from the 80s or from the early 90s? And they're not sure, with the signs of the crisis, the signs of, you know, ethnical conflict, the economy crisis, even like some simulation of war is already presented. But if you go to cultural text even deeper, like from the first economic reforms of the 60s in Croatia, you also have this wave of so-called black wave of the movies, when you can see the worker strikes in the movies and so on. So I will say this way of flirting with capitalism in Yugoslavia was showing like the holes in the system, which were kind of being prophetic to what happened later. Yes, so I agree, and it very complicates the whole narrative, but it's really important to understanding in a more broad and more complex way.
All right, I think I have to go because I have a couple other Zoom meetings, but
Thank you very much.
Masha, I'll be in touch about our happy hour.
Thank you
very
so
much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Masha. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.